The suspect, Michael Platt, was hit 12 times, but he just kept shooting. This is the moment the Bureau realized their bullets were useless. As the first shots ring out, the Bureau is about to realize they are catastrophically outgunned. One suspect, despite being hit multiple times, continues to fight with terrifying efficiency. The FBI's standard-issue ammunition is failing to stop the threat. By the time the smoke clears, 2 agents are dead and 5 others are wounded. Miami was a slaughter that proved the FBI was outgunned. To survive the next one, they had to invent a caliber that didn't exist: the .40 S&W. The 9mm lacked stopping power. The .45 lacked capacity. The FBI needed a hybrid that defied ballistics. The .38 special revolver was the reliable workhorse of the American detective, but it was painfully slow to reload in a high-stress environment. It also lacked the kinetic punch needed to neutralize a violent offender wearing heavy clothing or hiding behind cover. On the other side was the 9mm Parabellum. It offered high capacity and faster reloads, but it was heavily criticized for its perceived lack of stopping power in the field. The Bureau found themselves in a technological stalemate where neither option provided the absolute confidence required for federal operations. The Miami Firefight served as a brutal laboratory for these ballistics. During the engagement, the 9mm Silvertip rounds used by the agents performed exactly as they were designed to, yet the results were fatal for the Bureau. One suspect was struck by a 9mm round that penetrated his lung, but the projectile lacked the mass to incapacitate him instantly. This allowed the suspect to continue his assault for several minutes, long enough to claim the lives of 2 agents. The tactical void was no longer a theoretical debate among engineers. It was a cold, hard reality written in the blood of fallen officers. The Bureau realized they needed a middle ground that didn't yet exist on the commercial market. They wanted the high capacity of a semi-automatic platform, combined with the devastating terminal ballistics of a .45 ACP. They were searching for a magic bullet that could punch through car doors and windshields while still delivering maximum energy into a target. This requirement was born from the realization that modern gunfights often took place around vehicles and urban barriers. The .40 S&W history began at this exact moment, fueled by the urgent need to bridge the gap between speed and raw power. The pressure to arm agents with something superior was no longer a matter of administrative policy. It was a matter of survival for every man and woman wearing a badge in the field. The FBI Firearms Training Unit began an exhaustive series of tests to find the FBI Firearms Training Unit began an exhaustive series of tests to find the ultimate tactical solution. But their first choice was a beast that almost no one could tame. They initially settled on the 10mm Auto, a powerhouse cartridge championed by the legendary Jeff Cooper. On paper, it was the perfect answer to the failures in Miami. It possessed a flat trajectory, immense kinetic energy, and the ability to defeat automotive glass without deviating from its path. However, the reality on the firing line was a different story entirely. The 10mm Auto produced a violent, bone-jarring recoil that made rapid follow-up shots nearly impossible for the average agent. The pistols required to chamber the round, like the massive Smith Wesson 1006, were heavy, cumbersome, and difficult to conceal for undercover work. The Bureau had found their power, but they had sacrificed control. The turning point came when FBI ballistics experts began experimenting with reduced velocity 10mm loads. They discovered that a 180-grain bullet traveling at 950 feet per second provided the ideal balance of penetration and expansion. This became known as the FBI light load. It was at this moment that Bill West and the engineering team at Smith & Wesson saw a radical opportunity for optimization. They realized that if the FBI was only using a fraction of the 10mm case capacity, the extra brass was essentially dead space. By shortening the 10mm casing by approximately 0.142 inches, they could maintain the FBI's preferred ballistic profile while drastically reducing the overall footprint of the cartridge. This was the spark of genius that led to the birth of the .40 Smith & Wesson. This engineering shortcut was a masterstroke of efficiency that changed the geometry of the modern handgun. Because the new .40 caliber cartridge was significantly shorter than the 10mm auto, it no longer required a massive, oversized frame. Engineers found they could chamber this potent new round in pistols originally designed for the 9mm Parabellum. This meant that law enforcement agencies wouldn't have to retrain their officers on entirely new, bulky weapon systems. They could essentially keep the ergonomic, high-capacity frames they were already comfortable with, but upgrade the internal chambering to deliver a much heavier, more disruptive projectile. It was the ultimate compromise between the high capacity of the 9mm and the legendary stopping power of the .45 ACP. To make this work, the engineers had to navigate a minefield of internal pressures and mechanical tolerances. The .40 S&W was designed as a high-pressure cartridge, utilizing a small pistol primer to ignite a dense powder charge. This allowed the 180-grain projectile to mimic the terminal performance of the larger 10mm light load without the excessive grip circumference that had plagued earlier designs. Every millimeter of the casing was utilized, leaving no room for error. This precision engineering allowed Smith & Wesson to create a cartridge that fit perfectly into the human hand and the modern duty holster. They had successfully condensed a Magnum-class threat response into a package that was manageable for every agent, regardless of their physical stature. The arrival of the .40 S&W represented a fundamental shift in how ballistics were calculated for the streets of America. It wasn't just about the speed of the bullet or the weight of the lead. It was about the efficiency of the delivery system. By 1990, the collaboration between the FBI and Smith & Wesson had produced a cartridge that seemed to defy the traditional trade-offs of firearms design. It offered more frontal surface area than a 9mm for better energy transfer, yet it maintained a higher magazine capacity than the venerable .45 ACP. The industry was watching closely as the first production models began to roll off the assembly lines. The stage was set for a total takeover of the law enforcement market. But an unexpected rival was about to turn this American innovation into a global phenomenon.
Go! Clear left! Moving!
While Smith & Wesson was busy refining the steel-framed Model 4006 to house their new creation, they assumed they held all the cards. They were the primary partner of the Bureau, and they had the institutional momentum of the American firearms industry behind them. But they had underestimated the speed of a rising titan from Austria. Gaston Glock was not a traditional gunmaker. He was a specialist in polymers and manufacturing efficiency. He understood that the .40 S&W was more than just a new round. It was a market-shifting event. Through a combination of corporate intelligence and sheer engineering audacity, Glock obtained the dimensional specifications for the .40 S and W at the 1990 SHOT Show and rushed his pistols to market to beat Smith & Wesson's retail delivery. The engineering challenge for Glock was surprisingly simple compared to the task facing the Americans. Because the .40 S and W was designed to mimic the dimensions of the 9mm Parabellum, Glock realized he didn't need to build a new gun from the ground up. He simply had to modify the existing Glock 17. By enlarging the bore, adjusting the extractor, and strengthening the slide mass, the Glock 22 was born. It was a masterstroke of modularity. While Smith & Wesson was still polishing the heavy, traditional metal frames of their 4000 series pistols, Glock was already shipping lightweight, high-capacity polymer handguns to distributors. By the time the 1990 SHOT Show arrived, the handgun of the future wasn't American, it was Austrian. This wasn't just a failure of engineering for Smith & Wesson, it was a total defeat in the theater of corporate warfare. Glock didn't just wait for orders to come in. He went on a relentless offensive to capture the American law enforcement market. He understood that police departments were cash-strapped and hesitant to abandon their trusted revolvers. To break the deadlock, Glock offered aggressive, almost predatory trade-in programs. He allowed departments to swap their old, worn-out .38 special revolvers for brand-new .40 caliber pistols at almost no cost. It was a loss leader strategy that decimated the competition. Within months, the 9mm's reputation for being weak after the Miami disaster was being used as a primary sales tool to push the .40 S and W. The result was a total disruption of the tactical landscape. Police chiefs across the United States were under immense pressure to provide their officers with the best possible protection, and the .40 S and W was marketed as the ultimate insurance policy. It offered the stopping power the public demanded, and the high capacity that modern threats required. Glock's victory was so complete that the .40 S and W became synonymous with the American police officer. Every major manufacturer from Sig Sauer to Beretta was forced to scramble and adapt their designs or risk becoming obsolete in the eyes of the law.
Yeah, they went in clean right
here. The
here.
gold standard had shifted overnight.
Looks like a .38.
And the 9mm was relegated to the sidelines. As the 1990s progressed, the .40 S and W didn't just dominate the civilian and police markets. It fundamentally changed how ammunition was manufactured and sold. The sheer volume of the FBI's endorsement meant that every ammo plant in the country prioritized .40 caliber production lines. This corporate and political momentum created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because everyone was using it, the technology behind the bullets improved faster than any other caliber on the market. It was
Miami,
a feedback loop of dominance.
The ensuing investigation would uncover a
unbreakable.
complex web of deceit.
The
Starting
cartridge
here
was
in this
no
quiet
longer
suburban
just a
driveway.
ballistic solution. It was a cultural icon of authority. But as these pistols moved from the controlled environment of the test range to the chaotic reality of the street, the trade-offs of this high-pressure revolution began to reveal themselves in the heat of combat. Chapter 4. The Combat Crucible. The adoption of the .40 S and W by the FBI acted as a catalyst, triggering a massive migration toward the caliber by nearly every federal agency in the United States. From the Drug Enforcement Administration to the U.S. Marshals, the cartridge became the definitive signature of post-Cold War policing. On the streets,
The results were immediately quantifiable.
The heavier 180-grain projectiles provided significantly better barrier penetration through automotive glass and sheet metal. The very tactical obstacles that had caused the 9mm Silvertip to fail so catastrophically during the 1986 Miami Shootout. Field reports began to flood in, detailing high-stakes engagements where the .40 caliber performed with clinical precision, ending threats that might have required multiple follow-up shots with a lesser round. For the tactical operator, the appeal was psychological as much as it was mechanical. Officers felt a renewed sense of confidence carrying a weapon that promised the terminal ballistics of a .45 ACP, with the magazine capacity of a modern semi-automatic. In the high-stress environment of a felony stop or a building clearance, that confidence translated into decisive action. The caliber defined the tactical era of the late 90s and early 2000s, appearing in the holsters of elite units across the globe, who looked to the FBI as the gold standard for ballistics research. It was the era of the man-stopper, and the .40 S&W was the undisputed king of the hill, proving its worth in countless urban firefights where there was no room for error. However, the battlefield performance of the .40 S&W wasn't just about the lead hitting the target. It was about the weapon's ability to stay in the fight. The cartridge was designed to operate at similar pressures to the 9mm or the .45 ACP, generating a sharp, snappy recoil that tested both the shooter and the machine. In the hands of seasoned tactical teams, this was a manageable trade-off for the increased energy delivery. The cartridge became a symbol of a new philosophy in law enforcement. The idea that every round fired must carry enough kinetic potential to incapacitate an adversary instantly, regardless of the intermediate barriers in the way. It was a mechanical answer to a tactical tragedy, and for 2 decades it seemed the debate over handgun calibers was finally settled. Chapter 5. The Fatal Compromise. But as the .40 S&W reached the peak of its dominance, a hidden cost began to surface in training academies and armorers' rooms across the country. The very high-pressure loading that gave the cartridge its devastating performance was also its greatest liability. The snappy recoil impulse was significantly harder to manage than the 9mm, leading to a phenomenon known as recoil anticipation. Instructors noticed that qualification scores were dipping as agents struggled to maintain accuracy during rapid-fire strings. The Bureau had solved the power problem, but they had inadvertently created a marksmanship problem that affected the average officer's ability to place rounds where they mattered most under pressure. Worse still, the mechanical strain was beginning to tear the hardware apart. The unsupported chamber from the Miami aftermath was finally closing, revealing a dark truth about the engineering shortcuts taken during the caliber's rapid rise. Because the .40 S&W was often chambered in frames originally designed for the 9mm, the increased pressure put immense stress on the internal components. This led to the infamous Glock smile, a terrifying phenomenon where the unsupported section of the chamber in early polymer pistols would cause the brass casings to bulge or even rupture. These catastrophic failures, while rare, shook the confidence of the agencies that had bet their lives on the platform. The intense vibration and slide velocity accelerated frame wear, leading to cracked rails and broken pins long before the expected service life of the firearms. The ultimate irony, however, came from the lab. While the .40 S&W was putting holes in targets and frames alike, ballistics technology was undergoing a quiet revolution.
New bonded core bullet designs and advanced powder formulations allowed the 9mm to close the performance gap. By the mid-2000s, modern 9mm duty loads were achieving nearly identical terminal expansion and penetration depths as the .40 and W, but without the punishing recoil or the mechanical destruction of the host weapon. The magic bullet the FBI had spent decades searching for was no longer a heavy .40 caliber slug. It was a technologically superior 9mm. The tactical necessity that birthed the .40 and W was being eroded by the very science that created it, setting the stage for one of the most controversial pivots in the history of American law enforcement. The adoption of the .40 and W transformed the American tactical landscape almost overnight, moving from a specialized federal experiment to the standard issue reality for nearly 70% of law enforcement agencies. This wasn't merely a change in equipment. It was the birth of a new doctrine in the combat crucible of the 1990s. From the high-stakes drug interdictions of the DEA to the fugitive recovery missions of the U.S. Marshals Service, the .40 caliber became the definitive signature of the post-Cold War officer. It offered a psychological sense of security that the 9mm Parabellum simply couldn't match at the time. When agents stepped out of their vehicles, they knew they carried a round specifically engineered to address the tactical failures of the past. It was the caliber that defined the tactical era, providing a level of confidence that allowed units to engage high-threat targets with a perceived ballistic superiority. On the streets, the results of this shift were quantifiable and immediate. The .40 and W excelled in the very areas where the 9mm Silvertip had failed during the 1986 Miami Shootout. The heavier 180-grain projectiles maintained their integrity when passing through intermediate barriers like automotive glass and sheet metal. In tactical engagements involving vehicles, the .40 and W demonstrated a remarkable ability to punch through windshields without the radical deflection common in lighter calibers. This made it the premier choice for highway patrol officers and tactical teams who frequently operated in and around transit corridors. The cartridge provided a reliable balance of mass and velocity, ensuring that even after penetrating a car door, the bullet retained enough kinetic energy to neutralize a threat effectively. It was a mechanical solution to a very human problem, providing the stopping power required to end confrontations before they turned into prolonged disasters. The tactical dominance of the .40 and W also reshaped the training environment within elite academies. Because the cartridge operated at significantly higher pressures than the .45 ACP or the 9mm, it forced a revolution in handgun manipulation and recoil management. Instructors had to refine their techniques to account for the snappy muzzle rise, leading to more aggressive grip textures and improved ergonomics in duty pistols. This era saw the rise of the modern weapon-mounted light and high-visibility combat sights, all designed to complement the aggressive nature of the .40 caliber platform. It was a period of intense professionalization, where the gear was finally catching up to the lethal realities of modern urban combat. The cartridge wasn't just a piece of lead and brass. It was the centerpiece of a comprehensive system designed to win at all costs. Beyond the United States, the influence of the .40 and W rippled through international security forces. While Europe remained largely committed to the 9mm, specialized units in South America and parts of Asia began looking at the FBI's success with the .40 caliber as a blueprint for their own modernization. The cartridge became a symbol of American tactical ingenuity,
representing a middle ground that seemingly solved the age-old debate between capacity and power. It was the undisputed king of the tactical world for 2 decades, proving itself in countless high-stakes engagements where there was no room for error. The 40S&W had successfully closed the gap that the Miami disaster had exposed, but as the cartridge reached the peak of its popularity, the very intensity that made it effective began to reveal a hidden structural price. The immense success of the 40S&W came with a hidden biological and mechanical tax that began to surface in training academies across the country. While the ballistics were undeniable, the physics of the cartridge created a sharp, snappy recoil impulse that differed significantly from the heavy push of a .45 ACP or the light pop of a 9mm. This high-pressure spike caused a phenomenon known as recoil anticipation among many shooters. Even seasoned agents began to develop a flinch, subconsciously pushing the muzzle down just before the shot broke to compensate for the expected snap. As a result, qualification scores began to dip, and the time required to get back on target for a follow-up shot increased. The Bureau had solved the power problem, but they had inadvertently created a marksmanship hurdle that made it harder for the average officer to place rounds accurately under the adrenaline dump of a real gunfight. The strain wasn't just physical, it was deeply mechanical. The 40S&W operates at a standard pressure of 35,000 pounds per square inch, pushing the limits of the frames originally designed for the 9mm. This led to the infamous unsupported chamber failure that engineers had tried to ignore, accelerated wear and tear. Firearms that were expected to last tens of thousands of rounds began to see cracked frames, battered locking blocks, and fatigued recoil springs much earlier than anticipated. In the early days of polymer pistols, this pressure manifested in a terrifying way known as the Glock smile. Because some early .40 caliber handguns had unsupported chambers to ensure reliable feeding, the high-pressure brass would bulge at the base, looking like a grimacing mouth. In extreme cases, the casing would rupture entirely, venting hot gases into the magazine well and potentially shattering the grip of the weapon. As the 21st century progressed, the original justification for the 40S&W began to erode under the weight of material science. The magic bullet the FBI had sought in the late 80s was finally being realized, but not in the way they expected. Advanced metallurgy and the development of bonded core projectiles allowed 9mm ammunition to expand reliably and penetrate deeply, even through the same barriers that once required a heavier slug. Ballistics laboratories across the country were reaching a startling conclusion. Modern 9mm duty loads were now achieving nearly identical terminal performance to the 40S&W. The trade-off was becoming impossible to ignore. Agencies were paying for more expensive ammunition and more frequent gun repairs for a ballistic advantage that was rapidly vanishing in the face of modern engineering. By the mid-2010s, the tactical community began to realize that the 40S&W was a solution to a problem that technology had finally outpaced. The high capacity and lower recoil of the 9mm offered better hit probability, which ballistics experts argued was a more critical factor in surviving a shootout than the diameter of the bullet. The fatigue on both the shooters and the equipment had reached a breaking point, leading to a massive shift in institutional thinking. The very agency that had birthed the cartridge from the blood of the Miami Shootout was about to make a decision that would send the 40 S&W into a slow, professional twilight. The era of the heavy hitter was being challenged by a return to efficiency, setting the stage for a final autopsy of a legendary caliber. The high pressure that gave the 40 S&W its legendary stopping power eventually revealed a dark, mechanical truth that engineers could not ignore. While the cartridge successfully bridged the gap between the 9mm and the 45 ACP, it operated at a maximum pressure of 35,000 pounds per square inch, identical to the 9mm Parabellum, but with a larger casehead area
the
that
.38
increased
caliber
bolt
revolver,
thrust,
introduced
pushing
in the
the
early
limits
30s,
of handgun
quickly became
metallurgy
the standard
to the
issue for
absolute
detectives.
edge. This internal violence manifested in the infamous phenomenon known as the Glock smile, a structural anomaly where the unsupported chamber of early polymer pistols caused the brass casings to bulge dangerously. In extreme cases, the sheer force would lead to a catastrophic failure, rupturing the case and venting high-pressure gases into the magazine well. This was the fatal compromise of the tactical era. The Bureau had secured the ballistic performance they craved, but they had inadvertently shortened the service life of their firearms by thousands of rounds. Training academies across the United States began to report a troubling trend in officer performance that ran counter to the cartridge's design goals. The 40 S&W produced a sharp, snappy recoil impulse that was significantly more difficult to manage during rapid fire than the 9mm Parabellum. For many agents, this translated into recoil anticipation, a psychological flinch that pulled shots off target during high-stress qualifications. Instructors noticed that while the heavier 180-grain projectile was devastating when it hit, the actual hit probability was dropping among the average rank-and-file shooters. The FBI realized that a slower, more accurate string of fire from a smaller caliber was tactically superior to a powerful round that missed its mark. The mechanical advantage of the .40 caliber was being negated by the biological limitations of the human hand under pressure. As the 21st century progressed, advancements in projectile technology began to close the ballistic gap that had once defined the .40 S&W as the gold standard. The development of bonded core bullets and sophisticated jacket designs allowed the modern 9mm to expand and penetrate with a consistency that was previously impossible. Ballistic gelatin tests proved that the new 9mm duty loads could achieve the same critical depth and permanent wound cavity as the .40 caliber without the punishing wear and tear on the firearm frames. The FBI's Specialized Ballistics Research Unit concluded that the technological deficit of the 1980s had been solved by chemistry and physics rather than raw mass. The justification for the .40 S&W's heavy recoil and reduced magazine capacity was evaporating in the face of modern engineering. By 2015, the institutional momentum that had carried the .40 S&W to the top of the law enforcement world finally stalled. The Bureau made the landmark decision to return to the 9mm, citing better weapon longevity, higher ammunition capacity, and significantly improved shooter accuracy across the board. This shift sent a shockwave through the industry, as thousands of police departments followed the FBI's lead, flooding the secondary market with used .40 caliber pistols. The cartridge that was born from the tactical autopsy of a massacre had finally been outpaced by the very innovation it helped spark. The closing of this chapter in firearms history was not a failure of design, but a testament to how quickly the landscape of combat technology evolves when lives are on the line. The transition back to the 9mm was not merely a change in preference. It was a clinical acknowledgement that the .40 S&W
had fulfilled its historical mission.
For nearly 3 decades, this cartridge served as the backbone of American law enforcement, providing a bridge between the era of underpowered revolvers and the age of modern ballistics. It was the solution to a specific tactical
Archived
crisis
footage reveals
that
the
emerged on a
aftermath.
hot afternoon
These
in Miami,
vehicles hit multiple
and it reigned
times,
supreme
show the severity
while
of
the
the
rest of the
engagement
industry
that day.
played catch-up. The 40 S&W forced manufacturers to rethink frame durability, magazine geometry, and bullet expansion, driving a wave of innovation that benefited every caliber on the market. It was the catalyst that pushed the firearms industry into the high-performance era, proving that a single failure in the field could reshape an entire global supply chain. Today, the 40 S&W occupies a unique space in the tactical landscape, often viewed as a specialist's tool rather than a general issue standard. While federal agencies have moved on, the cartridge remains a favorite for those who operate in environments where barrier penetration through heavy clothing or automotive glass is a non-negotiable requirement. It survives in the hands of enthusiasts who appreciate its unique history and the sheer mechanical efficiency of its design. The secondary market is now saturated with high-quality police trade-in pistols, making the 40 S&W one of the most accessible and battle-proven calibers for the modern civilian shooter. It has transitioned from the magic bullet of the FBI to a reliable veteran of the shooting range, its reputation forged in the heat of the world's most scrutinized firefights. The legacy of the 40 S&W is ultimately one of engineering responding to tragedy. It stands as a permanent reminder that in the world of tactical ballistics, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Every increase in power comes with a cost in recoil. Every gain in size comes with a loss in capacity. And every solution eventually meets a new problem. The 40 S&W was the perfect answer for 1990, a necessary evolution that corrected the failures of 1986. As we look at the streamlined, high-capacity 9mm pistols of today, we see the DNA of the 40 S&W in their reinforced slides and advanced hollow point designs. It was the cartridge that had to exist so that modern ballistics could finally move forward, proving that sometimes you have to push a design to its breaking point to discover where the future truly lies. In the final autopsy of this legendary caliber, we find a story of survival, corporate maneuvering, and the relentless pursuit of stopping power. The 40 S&W didn't just change the guns in the holsters of American agents. It changed the way we think about the relationship between the shooter, the weapon, and the target. It remains a masterclass in how a tactical void can be filled with radical engineering and how a market can be disrupted by sheer speed and timing. Whether it is viewed as a relic of the past or a specialized tool for the present, the 40 S&W will always be remembered as the round that was born from blood and refined by necessity. The history of firepower is a cycle of innovation, and the 40 caliber remains one of its most impactful revolutions. If you want to see more tactical breakdowns of the world's most controversial calibers, subscribe and hit the notification bell. The history of firepower is still being written. The final verdict on the 40 S&W is not written in ballistic gel or sales charts, but in the evolution of tactical philosophy itself. For over 25 years, this cartridge served as the silent partner for hundreds of thousands of officers facing the unknown. It was the mechanical manifestation of a promise made after the 1986 Miami Shootout, that no agent would ever again be left under-equipped against a determined threat. While the Bureau eventually returned to the 9mm, they did so only after the 40
had forced a total revolution in bullet technology.
The heavy, bonded projectiles developed to make the 40 S&W effective were eventually miniaturized and adapted for the 9mm, effectively allowing the smaller caliber to finally live up to the FBI's stringent penetration standards. In a strange twist of engineering irony, the 40 caliber's greatest achievement was providing the research and development that ultimately led to its own replacement. The global legacy of the 40 S&W extends far beyond the borders of the United States. It triggered a massive shift in how handgun manufacturers approached frame durability and slide mass. Before the 40, most semi-automatic pistols were based on existing 9mm or 45 caliber designs. The immense chamber pressures of the 40 S&W, peaking at 35,000 psi, forced engineers to rethink metallurgy and recoil spring rates from the ground up. This era gave birth to the over-engineered handgun, a standard of ruggedness that benefits every shooter today, regardless of the caliber they choose. Even as police departments transition away from it, the secondary market is flooded with high-quality police trade-in 40 caliber pistols, making it one of the most accessible and affordable power options for civilian self-defense and target shooting. It remains a polarizing but respected veteran of the caliber wars. Looking back at the tactical autopsy of that April morning in Florida, the lessons of which led to the creation of the 40 S&W, we can see that the 40 S&W was never just a piece of brass and lead. It was a bridge between the era of the underpowered revolver and the age of the high-tech, high-capacity combat handgun. It filled a critical gap during a time when 9mm technology simply wasn't ready for the demands of modern law enforcement. The cartridge proved that the FBI was willing to listen to the hard lessons learned on the street and adapt, even if it meant creating an entirely new standard from scratch. It represents a moment in history where engineering met desperation, resulting in a tool that balanced the raw power of the 10mm with the practical dimensions needed for everyday carry. The 40 S&W didn't just win a market war, it defined a generation of tactical readiness. Today, the 40 S&W is often discussed in the past tense by ballistics experts, yet its influence is woven into the DNA of every modern service weapon. The transition back to the 9mm isn't a failure of the 40, but a testament to how far we have come in maximizing the efficiency of every grain of gunpowder. The history of human conflict is a constant cycle of tragedy followed by innovation, and the 40 caliber remains the most prominent example of that cycle in the world of small arms. It was the right answer for a dangerous time, a mechanical solution born from the blood of agents who deserved better than the equipment they carried. As we look toward the future of directed energy and advanced polymers, the story of the 40 Smith & Wesson stands as a reminder that every advancement in firepower is paid for by those who stood on the front lines when the technology was lacking. The story of the 40 S&W is a masterclass in how a single tactical failure can reshape an entire global industry. It reminds us that in the world of high-stakes engineering, there are no perfect solutions, only trade-offs between power, control, and longevity. If you want to understand the modern landscape of law enforcement and why your favorite handgun looks and performs the way it does, you have to look back at the disaster in Miami and the caliber that rose from its ashes. If you found this deep dive into the engineering and history of the 40 S&W valuable, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next breakdown of the weapons that changed the world.
The history of firepower is an ongoing narrative, and there are many more chronicles yet to be told. What caliber do you think truly holds the title of the ultimate balance? Let us know in the comments below, and we will see you in the next Tactical Autopsy.